In the autumn of 1983, Elaine S was preparing to move into a new apartment in a medium-sized city in the UK. She was not prepared for the horrifying events that were to follow. No one could have been prepared for those events. What happened to Elaine was so strange, so disturbing, that it is utterly without precedent in British history, and nothing quite like it has ever happened since. Elaine was 32 years old and had recently split up with her long-term boyfriend. They had never married and they had no children. When Elaine had been offered a new job as a legal assistant in a distant city, she had jumped at the chance, believing she could make a fresh start in life. Upon arriving at the new city, she immediately set to work searching for somewhere to live. Most of the apartments for rent were either too expensive or not decorated to Elaine's taste. She had already viewed 6 apartments when she spotted an advert for the place that was to become her home. The rent seemed reasonable and the apartment was located just a 5-minute walk from the city centre. The ad stated that the apartment was completely refurbished. She phoned the number on the ad and arranged a viewing immediately. When Elaine viewed the apartment, she found it even better than the ad had described. It was on the 4th floor of a modern apartment block on a quiet road that led towards the centre of the city. The flat was decorated in the minimalist style that was only to become really fashionable in the 1990s. Walls painted an off-white colour, the furniture either white or made from light-coloured woods. The kitchen was fitted with all the latest new appliances. Although the building itself was a little grey and plain, Elaine thought, the interior more than made up for that. The only thing she did not like was a strange discoloured patch on the wall of the kitchen. "What happened here?" she asked the letting agent, who was showing her the apartment. The agent said there had been a minor problem with damp due to a burst pipe, but the problem was now fixed and wasn't likely to reoccur. On the whole, Elaine loved the place and immediately agreed to rent it. "Could you tell me anything about the neighbours?" she asked the agent. The agent, a young man in a grey suit, seemed uncomfortable, Elaine later recalled. "The place on this side is empty," said the agent. "There's a chap living on that side, some kind of scientist I think, keeps himself to himself. I don't think you'll have any problems with him." Elaine couldn't wait to move in and begin her new job. She really felt that she was leaving her old life with all its problems behind. The apartment was nearly perfect. She officially moved in on October 18th, 1983, and set to work making the place her own, buying a couple of spider plants for the living room and hanging up some pictures. For the white sofa, she bought some brightly coloured cushions. She also took several photographs of the apartment with a small foldable camera, so she could eventually show her friends and relatives over 200 miles away in another town. For the next 2 weeks, everything seemed fine. Elaine began her new job. The people there seemed a little formal, but on the whole, pleasant and friendly. Occasionally there were some odd buzzing sounds from the apartment next door, but she never encountered her neighbour in person. She knew he must be in, because in the evening sometimes she heard the sounds of plates being put away or taken out of the cupboards from his kitchen, and cupboard doors being shut. She considered introducing herself or even making up an excuse, such as asking if she could borrow some sugar. But in the end, she did neither of these two things. As an attractive single woman, it occurred to her that the man could be some sort of weirdo and should never be able to get rid of him once he'd met her. In her 20s, Elaine had worked part-time as a model, and she still tended to attract a lot of male attention. She had previously attracted a stalker and had had to involve the police to get rid of the guy. She wasn't anxious to repeat that experience in a town where she hardly knew anyone. At the same time, she couldn't help but invent little fantasies to ease her loneliness in the new town. The agent had said her neighbour was a scientist. Perhaps her neighbour was a tall, dark, handsome intellectual. It was at the start of November that Elaine first noticed a sense of nausea, which she recorded in her diary. Upon getting out of bed, she felt sick and also a little dizzy. She attributed it to the take-out fish supper she had bought on the way home from work the day before. She had felt particularly tired after work and hadn't wanted to cook, so she'd stopped at a chip shop and bought chips and a battered cod. Perhaps she thought it had been a little off. She thought little more of the nausea, expecting it to subside, and went to work as usual. But the nausea didn't subside. It stayed with her throughout the whole day, and for the whole of the next day. On the third day, it seemed to improve a little, only to worsen again in the evening. She had made a friend at work, an older woman called Jan. Jan suggested cutting down on meat and drinking mint tea to settle her stomach. Elaine tried both, but they didn't seem to help. Around the 10th of October, Elaine's photographs came back from the chemist. She eagerly opened the package, planning to select some photos to post to her mother and father, but the photos hadn't turned out well. While a few were okay, most seemed curiously grainy and dull. By this time, Elaine had been continuously suffering from low-level nausea for over a week, and she decided to see a doctor. The doctor couldn't find anything wrong with Elaine and suggested the nausea might be due to stress or the change in diet associated with Elaine's new location and lifestyle. He prescribed a mild antacid and recommended avoiding spicy food or anything that seemed to worsen her nausea. It was also possible, the doctor said, that the fish Elaine remembered eating had indeed given her some kind of mild food poisoning. It would probably clear up in a few more days, if so. The pills the doctor gave Elaine helped a bit, and on some days she didn't have nausea at all. On other days, not only did she feel sick, but her stomach and even her throat began to hurt. She also felt generally run down. Her new job was certainly a little stressful, and Elaine began to wonder if she hadn't made a mistake in accepting it, but she didn't really feel that stressed. Her colleague Jan suggested she was suffering from homesickness or even a kind of low-grade culture shock, a psychological disturbance due to moving from the town where she'd grown up to a new city where she had no close friends. Food allergies were another possibility, and Elaine began to try cutting out one food after another, attempting to eliminate the culprit. She began to find the sight of herself in the mirror in the morning rather shocking. Her skin had lost its usual glow and was starting to look dull and sickly. Her hair also seemed dry and lifeless. Elaine decided to return to the doctor. By now, it was almost December. The weather had turned cold, and Elaine felt almost continuously ill. Even copious amounts of makeup could not hide the dark circles under her eyes, and she was losing weight. She simply had no appetite. She was also suffering mild but annoying headaches and bouts of diarrhea. This time, the doctor ordered a full set of tests. When the tests came back, they showed a mild deficiency in folic acid, but that was most likely due to Elaine now eating very poorly. More worryingly, her white blood cell count was abnormally low. The doctor ordered further tests, alarmed by the low white blood cell count, but everything came back negative. Eventually, Elaine was prescribed vitamin supplements and a mild sedative to help reduce the stress that she was now undoubtedly feeling on a daily basis. In her exhausted state, unable to eat well, she was having trouble coping with the challenges of her job. Elaine herself now felt that her problems were almost certainly digestive in origin, so she began to avoid any foods that she thought could be causing problems. She cut out gluten and dairy products completely. Her symptoms were continuing to worsen. Then, one day in December, Elaine awoke with a blinding headache. Unable to face work, she decided to stay in bed. As the day passed, Elaine felt worse and worse. She began vomiting and suffering severe diarrhea. A series of endless hammering and clanking sounds came from next door, making it hard for her to relax. Around midnight that night, she awoke from a light sleep and attempted to get to the toilet in something of a hurry. But Elaine didn't make it. Instead, she collapsed, hitting her head against the side of the bath. She awoke sometime later. How much later, she didn't know. She managed to crawl to her phone and phoned for an ambulance. At the hospital, the doctors were puzzled by her condition. They observed that her white cell count was low, and privately they speculated that she could have a disease that had emerged recently, known as AIDS. But her other symptoms didn't really fit, and she had no risk factors for AIDS. In addition to the headaches, nausea, diarrhea and dizziness, doctors noticed that parts of Elaine's skin were unusually red. They recommended that she avoid harsh sunlight until the cause of her problems could be identified. After 2 weeks, they discharged her, with an array of pills for her symptoms, but no firm conclusion. The doctors could find no sign of infection, nor of cancer. Elaine had felt hopeful when a junior doctor suggested hydrocarbon poisoning, perhaps benzene. The ground around her apartment could have become contaminated somehow, but subsequent tests showed no sign of benzene in her blood. Christmas came and went while Elaine was in hospital. Her parents visited her and, shocked at her appearance, tried to persuade her to move back in with them. But Elaine's parents tended to argue a lot with each other, so Elaine didn't accept their offer. In any case, she didn't want to give up on her new start in life so soon. When she returned home to the apartment, a sense of doom enveloped her. She still felt weak, dizzy, and nauseous. Clearly, she couldn't go on like this, so she decided to go and stay with her aunt, who lived in the countryside. Her telephone emitted loud crackling sounds when she tried to phone her aunt. She was barely able to make herself heard. But while explaining her health situation to her aunt, She burst into tears, and her aunt grasped the seriousness of the situation and promised to come and collect her. Staying with her aunt for 3 weeks did seem to improve her health a little, but only a little. However, she was afraid that she would lose her new job if she didn't get back to it soon, so her aunt agreed to drive her back to the apartment. By now, Elaine's aunt was convinced there was something wrong with Elaine's apartment. She was determined to find out what, but after a thorough search, she came up with nothing. Sick building syndrome, suggested her aunt. Some buildings, her aunt explained, simply make people ill for unknown reasons. Her aunt decided to go and talk to the scientist who lived next door to see if he was also experiencing symptoms. But no matter how much she hammered at the door next to Elaine's, no one answered the door. Elaine's aunt thought she could hear some kind of clanking sound coming from inside the apartment, but apart from that, she could detect no clear sign of human occupation. "I've met the people downstairs several times," Elaine protested. "They seemed fine." Downstairs lived a taciturn elderly couple. They were polite, but they didn't say much. Even so, they appeared to be in reasonable health. Her aunt couldn't persuade Elaine to leave the apartment, even though they both now suspected there could be something wrong with it, something that was causing Elaine's symptoms. However, Elaine still felt that a food intolerance was also a likely explanation. Together, they listed every possible explanation they could think of: an undiagnosed illness, a food allergy, stress, even the possibility that a colleague of Elaine's was poisoning her. Elaine decided to be extremely careful about what she ate at work and to never leave food unattended or accept an offer of tea or coffee. One of Elaine's colleagues, a rosy-cheeked man of about 50 years old, often brought in cakes that he said his wife had made. Elaine sometimes ate them. She resolved not to eat them again. Why would anyone want to poison her? But as Elaine's aunt said, there are some weird people in the world. In reality, Elaine was being poisoned, and the poison was destroying her, but it would take another 2 months for anyone to discover the source of the poison. Elaine attempted to return to work, but she was by now visibly unwell, and her boss kindly suggested that she work part-time for a few months until she felt better. When not at work, Elaine took to resting in bed. She rarely managed to sleep for even 4 hours a night, but felt a little better when lying in bed rather than sitting or standing up. Her nausea was interspersed with bouts of diarrhea and violent headaches. Her skin tingled and felt rough to the touch. Around the end of January, Elaine was in the shower prior to attempting to get to work when she abruptly began vomiting. Stumbling out of the shower, she again passed out. When she awoke, as her eyes focused, she became aware of something weird on the floor next to her. Something long, dark-coloured and wavy. Her eyes wouldn't quite focus on it. She struggled to her knees, feeling waves of nausea and dizziness, and forced her eyes to focus. The long, wavy object was a clump of her hair. Frantically, she tugged at her hair, and other parts of it pulled easily out of her scalp. She crawled to her bed and called a doctor. The doctor strongly recommended she return to hospital, but Elaine resisted. The hospital hadn't been able to do anything for her the last time she was there. Why would it be any different now? "Very well," said the doctor, "but if you aren't better in a week, you need to go to the hospital." Later on, Elaine wasn't even sure if the doctor had been real. She was beginning to slightly lose touch with reality. However, her medical records later confirmed that the doctor did indeed visit her, and she really did refuse to be admitted to hospital. Her brain was no longer operating normally, and her judgment was impaired. The doctor had seriously considered having Elaine sectioned under the Mental Health Act, forcibly admitted to a psychiatric facility, but since she did not appear clearly insane, he decided against it. She was breaking into floods of tears and seemed a little incoherent at times, but that was perhaps to be expected, considering her condition. The doctor visited again a week later and found Elaine's condition had worsened. Most of her hair had fallen out, and there were sore red patches on her face. She was extremely weak and was vomiting repeatedly. The apartment reeked of death. The doctor insisted Elaine be taken to hospital immediately and called an ambulance. Elaine said she felt like she was going into hospital to die, but the doctor dismissed the idea. Whatever this is, there are people at the hospital who'll be able to get to the bottom of it, he said. Hospital is where you need to be at the moment. Over the next 4 weeks, the hospital ran every test under the sun on her. Her blood test results were abnormal in several different ways, but there appeared to be no sign of infection, no sign of poisoning, no sign of genetic disorder. Her cells were simply deteriorating for no apparent reason. It was as if she was being slowly killed by a poison that was completely undetectable. Something new and fiendish, perhaps developed by some malicious rogue state on the other side of the world somewhere, but that was obviously ridiculous. The doctors at the hospital also considered whether she could be suffering from an entirely new and previously unknown virus. If so, there appeared to be no way to prove it, nor to refute the idea. There was nothing they could do for her. She recovered somewhat during her 4 weeks in the hospital. Eventually, she was well enough to return home, her illness still completely undiagnosed, but seemingly somewhat in remission. Her hair had begun to grow back, and the sores on her face and body had improved somewhat. You can guess what happened next. Soon after Elaine returned to her apartment, her symptoms returned and began to steadily worsen. These symptoms could not be explained by her work environment, since she had not returned to work. She therefore became convinced that they were somehow caused by her apartment, some kind of rare allergy to a specific set of conditions perhaps. But now, her funds were considerably depleted, and she did not feel comfortable renting a new apartment, since she didn't know whether she'd be able to work, and if she couldn't work, she couldn't pay the rent either. Elaine reluctantly decided to move back in with her parents. Arrangements were made and she began to pack, suppressing waves of dizziness and nausea as best she could with an array of medications, and suffering pounding headaches. She had procured a wig to cover the patchy remnants of her hair, but the wig could not disguise her disordered complexion, which now incited horror in all who saw it. Even large quantities of makeup could not make her appear well. The day before her parents had arranged to pick her up and take her home, she awoke with her worst headache yet. Shards of glass seemed to explode in her brain. Fragments of memories, words, colours and textures seemed to swirl around her. She attempted to rise from her bed, only to fall heavily back again. But this was no good. She had to get out of the place, and that meant packing at the very least. She forced herself to half stagger, half crawl to the kitchen. Perhaps if she made coffee, that would help. In the kitchen, she grabbed hold of the counter and attempted to stand up straight. Metallic bangs and clanking sounds were coming from the scientist's apartment next door. The discoloured paint on the wall was now completely flaking off, she noticed. Coffee. She had to make coffee. As she reached for the kettle, the room began to swirl around her, and she felt an intense wave of pain in her head and nausea. Elaine fell to the floor, dragging the kettle with her. When she awoke, she had no idea how much time had passed. Her head lay in a pool of water from the kettle. She tried to sit up, but something was wrong. She couldn't move anything on the entire left side of her body. Stars twinkled in the air around her. Loud banging sounds emerged from the direction of the kitchen wall. She tried to scream for help, but only muted gargling sounds emerged from her mouth. Summoning all her energy, she inhaled deeply and let out a piercing scream. The clanking abruptly stopped and was replaced by the sound of footsteps. Thank God, she thought. Someone's coming. She was swimming in and out of consciousness, but she thought she heard shouting, and then the sound of crashing and splintering. Someone ran into her apartment, and she managed to turn her head fractionally to see who it was. "Elaine," said the man, "I'm so sorry, look at you." She screamed again. The person looming over her hardly looked human. He was very short and round and completely bald. He wore old ripped clothes, and his skin was a mess of yellow and red blisters. The parts of it that weren't blistered were an unearthly whitish grey. He leaned over her, and she could smell his breath like rotting meat. "I can't let you leave, I'm afraid," he said. "My work is too important. You can come and live with me." Her eyes widened in horror, and she was about to let out another scream, but instead she fainted again. When Elaine awoke, she found herself in an unfamiliar bed, a drip in her arm. She was about to scream again when a woman appeared. "Elaine, can you hear me? You're in hospital. Everything will be okay. You've had a stroke." The elderly couple living downstairs had heard Elaine scream and had called the police. When the police arrived, they found Elaine's neighbour dragging Elaine's limp body into his apartment. They had arrested him and had pushed open the door to the apartment. What they saw there was quite unprecedented. Standing in the living room of the apartment next to Elaine's, adjacent to the wall of her kitchen, was a glowing machine, constructed largely out of scrap metal parts. A glass dome topped it off, and the dome was filled with an eerie blue glowing light. It was later determined that the device was a fuser, a machine that accelerated ions into each other to create nuclear fusion on a small scale. The device had been emitting highly dangerous levels of neutron radiation. Elaine's scientist neighbour had worked behind a flimsy steel screen that had scarcely protected even himself from the radiation. Vast amounts of radiation had poured into Elaine's kitchen. The renegade scientist claimed he had been trying to solve the world's energy problems by perfecting nuclear fusion, but his device was determined by experts to be useless for any serious purpose other than generating neutrons. Elaine had suffered a stroke brought on by neutron poisoning, but after 4 months in hospital with appropriate treatment, she was able to make an almost complete recovery. She was later able to return to her new job, living in a different apartment in a different area of the same town. Her hair grew back, the nausea and headache stopped, and she was left with only mild weakness on the left side of her body. The entire apartment block was condemned and had to be demolished after a thorough scientific investigation. The scientist was found to be unfit to stand trial. He was found, in fact, to be dangerously insane. It was impossible to determine whether this was due to the effects of the radiation or due to pre-existing conditions. He was sentenced to indefinite detention in a psychiatric facility, but his body was found to be so radioactive that he could not be kept in a typical psychiatric hospital. Instead, a remote farmhouse in the Scottish Highlands was converted specifically for him. He was not expected to live for very long, but he proved remarkably resilient to the effects of the neutron contamination. He is said to be still at the Highland facility today, completely insane and still dangerously radioactive. Rumours of his escape have not been confirmed. Thanks for listening. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. And also, please begin a new life as a German-speaking music student in Munich. It really helps me when you do that.